In the autumn of 2021, the engineers trying to save the Millennium Tower did something that sounds like surrender. They stopped and ordered the drilling to halt. Their own sensors, buried in the soil beneath downtown San Francisco, were reporting something that should not have been possible. The repair built to stop the tower from sinking was making it sink faster. Every new pile they drove toward bedrock tipped the 58-story building further off vertical until the lean at the top had lurched past 22 inches. They were not watching a skyscraper settle anymore. They were watching it fight back. And to understand how $350 million of luxury glass ended up in that position, you have to go back to a single number on a budget 15 years earlier. When the Millennium Tower opened in 2009, it was the proudest new address in San Francisco. 645 feet of blue glass, 58 stories, the tallest concrete building in the city. Condos sold to football champions and tech billionaires for as much as $13 million each, with marble lobbies, a private wine cellar, and an indoor pool near the top. By the time it was finished, every unit was sold. And from that very first year, before most owners had even unpacked, it had already begun to drop into the ground. That number on the budget bought one thing: a shortcut through the ground. And the ground beneath downtown San Francisco is not the solid base it appears to be from the street. The earth there is not rock, at least not near the surface. The financial district sits on a layered mess of soft marine clay, loose sand, and in places, landfill that was poured into the edge of the bay more than a century ago. Real bedrock, the kind you can trust to carry a skyscraper, lies more than 200 feet down, and in some spots closer to 250. So, when engineers raise a tall, heavy tower on ground like this, the textbook move is to drive long piles all the way down through the soft layers until they strike that bedrock, locking the building onto something that will never move. It is slow, and it is costly. The Transamerica Pyramid, the city's most famous tower, sits on a foundation engineered for exactly this kind of treacherous soil. The Millennium Tower did not go to bedrock. So why was the newest luxury skyscraper in the city built on a foundation that stopped short of solid stone? The answer comes down to cost and convention. Instead of driving piles 250 feet to bedrock, the engineers chose a friction pile foundation. They drove 945 concrete piles down only about 80 feet into a layer of dense sand and let the building rest on the friction between those piles and the soil gripping them. Think of the difference this way. A bedrock pile is a table leg planted on stone. A friction pile is a tent stake pushed into packed dirt. It holds firm as long as nothing beneath it ever shifts. It was cheaper, it was faster, and it was an accepted practice in San Francisco, so the developer, Millennium Partners, declined an outside peer review of the design. But there was a problem the budget never captured. This was not an ordinary building. It was an unusually heavy concrete tower, pressing down on the soil with enormous force, and directly beneath that dense sand sat a thick, soft, compressible layer of marine clay called Old Bay clay. This is the floating foundation. Every consequence that followed traces back to that single choice, to save money and time by resting a 645-foot tower on sand instead of stone. Here is what that choice set in motion. Picture a heavy book sitting on a thick, wet sponge. At first, the sponge holds the weight, but leave it there long enough, and the sponge slowly squeezes out its water, compresses, and the book sinks lower and lower. The Old Bay clay beneath the tower behaved like that sponge. The immense weight of all that concrete gradually pressed the water out of the deep clay. The clay compacted, and the entire building began to settle into the earth. And it did not settle evenly. Because the soil was thicker and softer on one side, the tower sank faster toward the northwest, toward the corner of Fremont and Mission. A building does not simply go down when that happens. It leans. The engineers had predicted the tower would settle 4 to 6 inches over its entire lifetime, a small and manageable amount. By the time construction finished in 2009, it had already sunk around 10 inches, double the lifetime prediction, and not a single resident had moved in yet. By some measurements, it was dropping close to an inch every year and tilting a little further with each one. The public did not learn the truth for years. Then, in 2016, the story broke. The Millennium Tower had sunk roughly 16 inches into the ground and was visibly leaning at the top, so far that satellites in orbit could measure the tilt from space. The headlines wrote themselves. San Francisco had built its own leaning tower. Residents began noticing the small signs they had explained away for years. Marbles that would not sit still on a counter. Cabinet doors that drifted shut on their own. And in one now famous living room high above Mission Street, a golf ball that rolled across the floor, picking up speed every single time it was set down. The signs were not only in the apartments. In the parking garage beneath the tower, cracks opened in the concrete walls, and engineers fitted them with gauges to track every fraction of an inch of movement, while residents parked their cars beside them. One early morning in 2018, the building let out a loud popping sound in the dark, and a window on the 36th floor cracked. Years later, during a winter storm, panes of glass broke loose from the facade and shattered on the sidewalk along Mission Street. And all of this was unfolding in one of the most earthquake-prone cities on Earth. Reporters kept reaching for the same comparison, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, though Pisa leans far more dramatically. The deeper fear in San Francisco was what a major earthquake might do to a heavy tower already off balance and resting on sand rather than anchored to rock. So, how do you fix a skyscraper that is sinking into the bay? The plan, led by structural engineer Ronald Hamburger, was finally to do the thing the building should have done from the start. Crews would drill new piles down through the sidewalks on the two leaning sides, all the way to bedrock, more than 200 feet below, and shift part of the tower's weight onto them. Hamburger compared it to sliding a jack under the corner of a car with a flat tire. This is the moment this story opened on. When the drilling began in late 2020, the monitoring sensors recorded exactly what no one wanted to see. The building started sinking faster. The vibration from boring through that deep clay was loosening it and worsening the very problem the work was meant to cure. The lean at the top, already severe, lurched several inches further, past 22 inches. Hamburger halted everything, and the city ordered that nothing resume until the plans were reviewed. The repair meant to rescue the tower had, for a moment, become the thing driving it down. By now, the Millennium Tower was no longer only an engineering story. It was a war. 9 separate lawsuits piled up, dragging in roughly 400 different parties. The homeowners sued the developer. The developer pointed next door, blaming the agency building the giant new transit center, arguing its deep excavation and groundwater pumping had drained the soil and worsened the sinking. The transit authority fired back that the tower's own foundation was the sole cause, noting the building had already sunk and begun leaning before they ever broke ground. The city attorney sued over what buyers had been told, declaring that the old principle of buyer beware did not stretch to cover a sinking skyscraper. For the people living there, none of this was abstract. Many had poured their life savings into homes that were now nearly impossible to sell, in a building they were told could take decades to stabilize. In 2020, after years of filings, the parties reached a global settlement worth around $100 million to fund the repair, with roughly $30 million of that coming from the transit authority, and therefore from taxpayers. No one formally admitted fault. The tower simply kept leaning while the lawyers argued. So why not just anchor it to bedrock, finish the job, and end the story? Because by then, the building had revealed its cruelest trap. The only way to reach solid rock was to drill, and the drilling itself disturbed the fragile clay and made the tower sink faster. The cure and the disease were the same action. The engineers had to invent a slower, gentler, low-vibration drilling method and shrink the entire plan from 52 piles down to just 18, simply to finish the work without tipping the tower further. When that scaled-down fix was finally completed in 2023, the engineers announced a real victory. The sinking had been arrested. The building had even risen a fraction of an inch back out of the ground, and the repair later won a national award for structural engineering. But the tower still leans roughly 28 inches at the top today. The fix corrected only about a quarter of the tilt its own model had promised, and some engineers say a full straightening, if it ever happens, could take as long as 40 years. In 2024, monitoring raised a fresh worry that the building may now be settling in its center. Residents who once paid millions have sold their units at staggering losses, some for less than half of what they cost, and were then handed a surprise bill of nearly $7 million to cover the repair's overruns. For all the engineering on display, the tower's deepest problem was never really about piles, or clay, or vibration. It was about a philosophy, the quiet belief that a small saving at the very beginning, a choice to rest on sand instead of stone, would never come back to demand its full price. Every skyscraper in the world makes 1,000 invisible decisions before its first window is ever set in place, and almost all of them stay hidden. This one did not. So the next time you stand at the base of a tower and crane your neck to look up, remember that the most important part of it is the part you cannot see, the ground it quietly agreed to trust. The Millennium Tower still stands over downtown San Francisco, stabilized, occupied, and slowly, silently leaning into the bay.